The afternoon of March 6, 1944. 25,000 feet above the center of the Third Reich, Berlin. The sky is a chaotic canvas of flak bursts, smoke trails, and the desperate geometry of air combat. Oberleutnant Karl Heinz, a veteran pilot of Jagdgeschwader 1, sits in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190. He is tired, but he is confident. The American heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, are attacking the capital in massive numbers. But Karl knows the rules of the game. He knows the geography of the air war. The American escort fighters, the heavy P-47 Thunderbolts and the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings, are formidable, but they have an Achilles heel: fuel. They can escort the bombers as far as the German border, perhaps a bit deeper, but then they must turn back. They simply do not have the range to reach Berlin and fight. Karl checks his fuel gauge. He is over his home turf. He has the endurance to wait. He watches the American fighter screen turn back west, their fuel tanks running low. The bombers are now alone. They are naked. This is the moment the Luftwaffe waits for. Karl signals his flight. Attack! They roll over and dive, screaming down from high altitude, lining up the slow, lumbering bombers in their sights. It is going to be a slaughter. Then he hears it. A high-pitched, banshee wail that cuts through the roar of his own BMW radial engine. It is a sound unlike the deep growl of a thunderbolt or the throaty rumble of a Spitfire. It is a sharp, whistling scream caused by air rushing over gun ports at 450 miles per hour. Before Karl can react, tracers flash past his canopy. He looks up, expecting to see another German plane. Instead, he sees a slim, silver shape with square wingtips and a massive air scoop under the belly. It shouldn't be here. It is physically impossible for a single-engine Allied fighter to be this deep in Germany. The silver plane is a North American P-51 Mustang. It hasn't just reached Berlin. It has arrived with enough fuel to fight. Karl pulls his Focke-Wulf into a hard turn, relying on his aircraft's superior roll rate. The American follows him effortlessly. The Mustang is faster, cleaner, and flown by a pilot who isn't worried about fuel. In seconds, the hunter becomes the prey. Karl's plane is shredded by 6.50 caliber machine guns. As he bails out over the burning city he swore to defend, he realizes the war has fundamentally changed. The roof has been blown off Fortress Europe. There is no sanctuary left. To understand how that silver ghost appeared over Berlin, we have to go back 4 years to a hotel room in New York City in April 1940. The British Purchasing Commission was desperate. The Battle of Britain was looming, and the Royal Air Force needed fighters. They approached Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, NAA. They asked him to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license for the RAF. The P-40 was a decent plane, but it was 1930s technology. It was rugged but heavy and slow. Kindleberger, a man who combined engineering genius with industrial arrogance, looked at the British officials and said, no. He refused to build an obsolete aircraft. Instead, he made a counteroffer that sounded like madness. I can build you a better airplane, he told them. And I can design and build the prototype in 120 days. The British were skeptical. Developing a new fighter aircraft usually took years. 120 days was barely enough time to finish the blueprints, let alone build a flying machine. But they were desperate, so they agreed. The clock started ticking. Back in California, legendary designers Edgar Schmid and Raymond Rice mobilized their team. They worked 7 days a week, sleeping on drafting tables. They didn't just want to build a plane. They wanted to build the most aerodynamically perfect machine ever created. They looked at every rivet, every joint, every curve. They were obsessed with drag, the invisible hand of air resistance that holds an airplane back. On September 9, 1940, just 102 days after the contract was signed, the prototype designated NA-73X was rolled out of the hangar. It had no engine because the engine supplier was late, but the airframe was complete. It was sleek, angular, and looked fast even while sitting on its wheels. It was an industrial miracle. The team had beaten the deadline not by cutting corners, but by working with a feverish intensity driven by the knowledge that the world was burning. The P-51 Mustang looked different from other fighters of the era, and the reason lay in its wings. Most aircraft wings in 1940 used a traditional teardrop cross-section, with the thickest part of the wing near the front edge. This design created plenty of lift, but it also created turbulence. As air flowed over the wing, It became chaotic and sticky very quickly, creating drag that slowed the plane down. Edgar Schmid and his team decided to gamble on a radical new theory developed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the laminar-flow wing. In a laminar-flow wing, the thickest part of the cross-section is moved much further back, almost to the middle of the wing. The curve is more gradual. This allows the air to flow smoothly, in laminar layers, over a much larger percentage of the wing's surface before it breaks up into turbulence. The theoretical advantage was massive. A significant reduction in drag, meaning the plane could fly much faster with the same amount of horsepower. But it was risky. The wing had to be manufactured with incredible precision. A single dent, a protruding rivet, or even a layer of dead bugs on the leading edge could disrupt the airflow and ruin the effect. North American Aviation accepted the challenge. They developed new manufacturing techniques to ensure the wing surface was as smooth as glass. They flush riveted the skin. They polished the aluminum. When the wind tunnel tests came back, the results were shocking. The Mustang had significantly less drag than the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt. They didn't stop there. They looked at the cooling system. Liquid-cooled engines require radiators, which create massive drag. Most designers just stuck a radiator under the wing or chin and accepted the speed penalty. The Mustang designers used the Meredith Effect. They placed the radiator in a large scoop under the fuselage. As air entered the scoop, it was heated by the radiator, which caused it to expand. This expanding air was then jetted out the back of the scoop, creating a tiny amount of thrust, like a jet engine. The cooling system didn't just cool the engine, it actually helped push the plane forward. Despite the aerodynamic brilliance, the early Mustang was a failure. When the first production models, Mustang is, arrived in England in 1941, the RAF pilots were excited by the sleek lines and modern cockpit. But as soon as they took it up to combat altitude, the excitement died. The problem was the heart of the beast. The Mustang was powered by the Allison V1710 engine. It was a good American engine, reliable, tough, and powerful at low altitude. But it had a fatal flaw. Its supercharger was primitive. It was a single-stage, single-speed supercharger designed for low-level operations. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine gasped for air. Its power output dropped off a cliff. At 25,000 feet, where the aerial battles against the Luftwaffe were taking place, the Mustang was a sitting duck. It was slower than the Bf-109 and the FW-190. The British were disappointed. They couldn't use it as a fighter. They relegated the Mustang to Army cooperation duties, low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. It was excellent at this role because it was fast on the deck and could take a beating, but it was a waste of a superior airframe. In the United States, the situation was even worse. The Army Air Forces were focused on the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. They saw the Mustang as a foreign project built for the British. They even modified it into a dive bomber, the A-36 Apache, adding dive brakes that ruined the aerodynamics. The world's most advanced fighter airframe was being used to bomb trucks and trains, completely ignored by the generals who were desperately looking for a long-range escort fighter. The Mustang was on the verge of becoming a footnote in history, a beautiful plane with a bad heart. The salvation of the Mustang came from a British test pilot named Ronald Harker. On April 30th, 1942, Harker took a Mustang I up for a test flight near Duxford. He was stunned by the handling. The controls were crisp, the dive speed was incredible, and the visibility was excellent. He realized that the airframe was superior to the Spitfire. It just needed an engine. Harker landed and supposedly said to the engineers, "This aeroplane would be a world beater if you put a Merlin 61 in it." The Rolls-Royce Merlin 60 series was the engine that powered the latest Spitfires. It featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger with an intercooler. It was a masterpiece of high-altitude engineering. It breathed fire at 30,000 feet. The idea was approved. Rolls-Royce engineers in England and Packard engineers in America, who were building Merlins under license, began the conversion. They took 5 Mustang airframes and shoehorned the Merlin engine into the nose. It was a tight fit. They had to modify the cowling and install a new 4-bladed propeller to handle the increased power. When the prototype, the XP-51B, took to the air in late 1942, the results were staggering. The top speed jumped from 390 miles per hour to over 440 miles per hour. The service ceiling shot up from 30,000 feet to nearly 42,000 feet. The climb rate doubled. Suddenly, The Mustang wasn't just a low-level scout. It was the fastest, highest-flying fighter in the Allied inventory. It could outrun a Focke-Wulf 190. It could outturn a Messerschmitt 109 at high speed. And crucially, thanks to its low-drag laminar-flow wing, it burned fuel at a miserly rate. A P-47 Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons of fuel an hour just cruising. The Mustang burned half that. The marriage of the American airframe and the British engine had created a hybrid monster. The Army Air Forces, realizing their mistake, immediately ordered mass production. The P-51B, and later the definitive P-51D with the bubble canopy, began pouring out of factories in California and Texas. The weapon that would kill the Luftwaffe had been forged. By late 1943, the P-51 had the engine to fight at high altitude, but it still needed the range to get there. The internal fuel tanks could get it to the German border, but fighting over Berlin required staying power. The solution was the external drop tank. Drop tanks were not a new idea. The Luftwaffe used them. The Japanese used them. But the American approach to drop tanks was a masterclass in industrial logistics. They needed thousands of them. They needed them to be cheap, lightweight, and completely disposable. Enter the 75-gallon and 108-gallon tanks. Some were made of aluminum, but as metal became scarce, the British and Americans developed tanks made of compressed paper and glue. Yes, paper. These paper tigers could hold high-octane aviation fuel for hours without leaking, mostly. They cost pennies to make compared to metal tanks. For German pilots, these tanks were a psychological horror. Imagine sitting in your Focke-Wulf 190 over Hamburg. You see a formation of Mustangs approaching. You check your fuel gauge. You have 45 minutes of flying time. You assume the Americans are in the same boat. You assume they have to turn back soon. Then, you see a puff of white mist from under the wings of the Mustangs. They are jettisoning their tanks. Hundreds of silver or gray paper. Teardrop shapes tumble from the sky. To the German pilot, this is a message. We just flew 400 miles to get here, and we are just now starting the fight with full internal tanks. The Mustangs drop the tanks, switch to internal fuel, and suddenly become aerodynamically clean. They are now fighting over the enemy's capital city with the same energy and endurance as if they had just taken off from an airfield 10 miles away. The drop tank technology turned the English Channel into a highway. It meant there was no front line in the sky anymore. The front line was wherever a Mustang pilot decided to drop his tanks. In early 1944, a command change occurred that doomed the Luftwaffe. Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle, the hero of the Tokyo raid, was an aggressive, no-nonsense leader. Until that moment, the standing order for escort fighters was, stay with the bombers. P-51 and P-47 pilots were tethered to the B-17 formations. They could only attack German fighters that directly threatened the bombers. If the Germans dived away, the Americans had to let them go. The German pilots knew this. They would attack, dive, and run to safety. Doolittle walked into the headquarters of 8 Fighter Command. He looked at a map on the wall. He pointed at a sign that said, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle ordered the sign taken down. He replaced it with a new doctrine. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy the German Air Force. He unleashed the Mustangs. The pilots were told, go find them. Kill them in the air. If they won't come up, go down and kill them on the ground. This changed everything. Mustang squadrons began ranging far ahead of the bomber streams. They roamed freely over Germany in fighter sweeps. They didn't wait for the Luftwaffe to assemble. They attacked the assembly points. When German fighters tried to take off, Mustangs were waiting in the traffic pattern, shooting them down before they could retract their landing gear. When German fighters landed to refuel, Mustangs strafed the airfields. This was the butcher of the sky phase. The P-51 was perfectly suited for it. Its high speed allowed it to catch fleeing Germans. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, while lacking the explosive punch of German cannons, had a high rate of fire and carried a massive amount of ammunition. Over 1,800 rounds total. A Mustang pilot could spray a German airfield, destroy 3 parked planes, shoot up a control tower, and still have ammo left to fight his way home. The Luftwaffe began to bleed to death. They lost experienced pilots who were shot down while taking off, landing, or training. The safety of the ground was gone. The sanctuary of the rear area was gone. Doolittle and the Mustang turned the air war from a defensive escort mission into an offensive hunt. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, was a man of immense ego and delusion. He had promised Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Ruhr. He had dismissed the Americans as cowboys who could only build fridges and razors. But Göring was also a World War I fighter ace. He understood air combat. He understood the mechanics of flight. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, about the moment Göring knew the war was lost. It happened in March 1944. He was looking at reports of a raid on Berlin. He asked his aides where the American fighters had turned back. They told him the fighters hadn't turned back. They were over the capital. Göring reportedly went out to see for himself. He looked up into the gray sky over Berlin. He saw the contrails of the bombers. And weaving around them, he saw the small, sharp silhouettes of single-engine fighters. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, he later told Allied interrogators, I knew the jig was up. It wasn't just the presence of the planes. It was what they represented. They represented an industrial power that could solve the impossible problem of long-range escort in 2 years. They represented a pilot training pipeline that could put thousands of aggressive young men in the air, while Germany was scraping the bottom of the barrel. The P-51 over Berlin was the physical manifestation of Germany's strategic defeat. The master race had been out-engineered. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe played its final card, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was a technological marvel. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51. It carried 4 30mm cannons that could vaporize a bomber with a single hit. When the jets first appeared, Allied intelligence was terrified. If Germany could produce enough of them, they could reclaim air superiority. P-51 pilots reported seeing strange aircraft without propellers that zoomed past them so fast they couldn't even track them with their turrets. In a straight line, a Mustang stood no chance against a Swallow, the German name for the 262. But the Mustang pilots found a way. They realized the jet had weaknesses. The early turbojet engines were fragile. You couldn't throttle them up and down quickly, or they would flame out. The jet needed a long concrete runway to take off and land. And at low speeds, it was a brick. The Mustang pilots adopted rat-catching tactics. Instead of trying to dogfight the jets at 30,000 feet, they hovered over the German jet bases at Akmar and Rhein. They waited. When a Me-262 pilot slowed down to land, dropping his gear and flaps, his speed dropped to 150 miles per hour. He was vulnerable. The Mustangs would dive from the clouds, screaming down at 450 miles per hour. One famous encounter involved Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier. Flying his P-51D Glamorous Glennis, he spotted a Me-262 on final approach. The German pilot saw him and tried to accelerate, but the primitive jet engines couldn't spool up fast enough. Yeager shredded the jet with a single burst. It was a brutal, unsporting tactic, but it worked. The P-51, a piston-engine plane design from 1940, defeated the future of aviation not by being faster, but by being there. It suffocated the jet force in its cradle. The Germans had the better technology, but the Americans had the air superiority to make that technology useless. By May 1945, the P-51 Mustang had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other Allied fighter in Europe. It had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. It had escorted the bombers that ground German industry to dust. But its legacy goes beyond the kill counts. The P-51 represented the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design. The Laminar-flow wing, the radiator scoop, the bubble canopy, it was the perfect synthesis of form and function. It was, as the pilots called it, the Cadillac of the sky. The Mustang proved that in a global war, good enough isn't enough. You need excellence, and you need it in quantity. The P-40 was good enough to hold the line. The P-47 was good enough to pound the ground. But the P-51 was the silver bullet that pierced the heart of the enemy defense. It also proved the value of collaboration. The P-51 was an American airframe with a British heart, the Merlin engine concept, and American mass production. It was the ultimate Allied weapon. After the war, while other propeller planes were scrapped, the P-51 served on. It fought in Korea. It served in air forces around the world for decades. Today, when you see a P-51 at an airshow, gleaming in the sun, You aren't just looking at a vintage airplane. You are looking at the machine that proved the experts wrong. You are looking at the plane that flew 4,000 miles to tell Hermann Göring that the war was over. The German pilots who saw that silver shape appear over Berlin in 1944 felt a cold dread because they realized the impossible had happened. The ocean had shrunk. The distance had vanished. And there was nowhere left to hide.